The Echo in the Silence. Chapter 1. The Unclaimed Daughter. The shrill ring of the telephone tore through the quiet afternoon. Evelyn Reed, a woman whose life had settled into the gentle rhythm of solitude, almost didn't answer. Who called at 2:37 p.m. on a Tuesday anyway? Probably a telemarketer. But something, a subtle shift in the air perhaps, urged her to pick up. Hello? Her voice, usually a calm murmur, held a slight edge of annoyance. Is this Evelyn Reed? A man's voice, tired but professional, responded. My name is Dr. Aaron Mitchell. I'm calling from St. Jude Medical Center in Clarksville, Tennessee. Evelyn's brow furrowed. Tennessee? She knew no one in Tennessee. Yes, this is Evelyn Reed. How can I help you, doctor? There was a pause, a breath held, then the words came, slow and deliberate, each one a hammer blow. Mrs. Reed, I regret to inform you that your daughter, Lillian Adams, was admitted to our hospital this morning after a serious car accident. She's in critical condition, currently in a medically induced coma. The world tilted. My daughter? Evelyn's voice was a whisper, the words barely forming. Doctor, I think there's been a mistake. I don't have a daughter. A longer pause this time. Evelyn could almost hear the doctor sifting through files, checking and rechecking. Mrs. Reed, according to her personal effects, specifically a worn photo tucked into her wallet and her own statement to the paramedics before she lost consciousness. You are listed as her mother, Lillian Adams, age 24. Lillian Adams. The name echoed in the empty spaces of Evelyn's Boston brownstone. 24 years old. A daughter. It was an impossibility. Her life had been carefully constructed after her husband's passing a decade ago. A comfortable retirement from teaching literature, quiet evenings with books, occasional visits from a few close friends. No children, never any children. It had been a quiet sorrow, a path not taken, but one she had long since accepted. Doctor, she said, her voice firmer now, bordering on disbelief. I assure you, there is a profound error. I have never given birth. I have no children, biological or adopted. I understand your confusion, Mrs. Reed. Dr. Mitchell replied, his tone softening with a hint of compassion. However, given the circumstances and the severity of Miss Adams' condition, we needed to contact her next of kin immediately. She was very clear, Mrs. Reed, your name. She repeated it several times. A chill traced its way down Evelyn's spine. A young woman, gravely injured, on the precipice of unconsciousness, calling her name? It was beyond bizarre. It was unsettling. What exactly happened? Evelyn asked, the question escaping her lips before she could fully process it. A part of her, the logical part, screamed to hang up, to dismiss this as a cruel prank or a bureaucratic mix-up. But another part, a smaller, more fragile part, was tugged by an invisible thread. Dr. Mitchell detailed the accident, a head-on collision on a winding rural road. The other driver was fine, but Lillian had sustained severe head trauma and internal injuries. She was stable, for now, but the next 48 hours were critical. We need someone here, Mrs. Reed, the doctor urged gently. She needs someone, even if you believe it's a mistake. There's a young woman fighting for her life, and she identified you. The silence on the line stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Evelyn's mind raced. Was it a scam? Would they ask for money? No, the doctor hadn't asked for anything, just her presence. And the sincerity in his voice. It was compelling. What if, by some unfathomable twist of fate, this wasn't a mistake? What if somehow A piece of her life she knew nothing about had just crashed into existence. "Give me the address," Evelyn said, the words surprising even herself. "I'll be on the first flight." Chapter 2. The Journey to Clarksville. The flight from Boston to Nashville felt interminable. Evelyn sat by the window, watching the familiar New England landscape morph into the sprawling farmlands of the South. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions, anxieties, and a strange, unfamiliar flicker of hope. Hope for what? She didn't know. Hope that this wouldn't be a wild goose chase? Hope that the truth, whatever it was, wouldn't shatter the carefully constructed piece of her life? She had packed a small overnight bag, her passport, and a handful of emergency cash. The old photo album, tucked away in the attic for years, suddenly felt like a critical piece of evidence. Maybe, just maybe, there would be a face, a clue, a forgotten connection that could explain this impossible call. But even as she clutched the album, she knew it was a desperate act. Her past was an open book, or so she thought. Upon landing in Nashville, the air was thicker, warmer, carrying the scent of rich earth and distant rain. She rented a car, the GPS guiding her through unfamiliar roads towards Clarksville. The further she drove from the familiar concrete canyons of Boston, the more surreal the situation became. St. Jude Medical Center was a modern, sprawling complex, a stark contrast to the small, brick-faced hospitals she remembered from her youth. The fluorescent lights of the waiting room were harsh, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and muted anxieties. "Evelyn Reed," she announced to the receptionist, her voice betraying a slight tremor. "I'm here to see Dr. Mitchell." A few minutes later, a young man, tall with kind eyes and a weary demeanor, approached her. He wore scrubs, and his name tag read, Dr. Aaron Mitchell. He extended a hand. "Mrs. Reed, thank you for coming. I'm Aaron Mitchell." His handshake was firm, his gaze direct and empathetic. "Doctor, please," Evelyn began, her voice low. "You must understand my position. This whole situation is unbelievable. I don't have a daughter. I need to understand why this young woman, Lillian, said my name." Dr. Mitchell nodded, leading her down a quiet corridor. "I understand completely, Mrs. Reed. It's an unusual situation. We've done a thorough search of her belongings. There's a single photo in her wallet. It's of you, Mrs. Reed, taken many years ago. It looks like a high school yearbook photo. Perhaps?" Evelyn felt a jolt. A high school photo? That was even more perplexing. Who would have that? And why would it be in the wallet of a young woman claiming to be her daughter? And when she was conscious, even briefly, she called out, "Mom, Evelyn," several times. Dr. Mitchell continued, stopping outside a room. "It wasn't a hallucination, Mrs. Reed. It was clear." He paused, his hand on the door handle. "Before we go in, Mrs. Reed, I must prepare you. Lillian is in a critical state. She's heavily sedated, and her injuries are extensive. She won't be responsive." Evelyn braced herself, but nothing could have truly prepared her for the sight inside. Lying on the hospital bed, surrounded by an array of blinking machines and beeping monitors, was a young woman. Her face was bruised and swollen, a bandage wrapped around her head. Tubes snaked from her nose and mouth, connecting her to the silent, humming machinery that sustained her. She looked fragile, utterly helpless. Evelyn's gaze swept over the girl's face. No resemblance, no familiar curve of a cheekbone, no echo of her own eyes. And yet there was something, a flicker of something in the stillness of her pale face. Evelyn couldn't place it, but it was there, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper from a forgotten corner of her mind. "She looks so young," Evelyn murmured, the words catching in her throat. A profound sadness, alien and sharp, pierced through her. This stranger, This daughter she didn't have was suffering. And inexplicably, Evelyn felt it too. Dr. Mitchell stood beside her, his presence a comforting anchor. "She's a fighter, Mrs. Reed. We're doing everything we can." Evelyn reached out, her hand hovering over the girl's bandaged arm, then gently resting there. The skin was cool beneath her fingers. Lillian Adams, a stranger yet somehow connected. This was no longer just a bizarre mistake. It was a mystery, deep and profoundly personal. She had to find out why. She had to find the truth behind the echo. Chapter 3. Threads of Memory. Evelyn found herself settling into a makeshift routine at the hospital. She booked a room at a nearby motel, but most of her waking hours were spent by Lillian's bedside. She read aloud from her favorite novels, soft murmurs of poetry and prose filling the sterile room. She spoke to Lillian, telling her about Boston, about the changing seasons, about the quiet joys of her life. She didn't know if Lillian could hear, but it felt right. It felt necessary. Dr. Mitchell, true to his word, provided Evelyn with all the information he could. Lillian's last known address was a small apartment in Clarksville. No immediate family listed, no emergency contacts other than the mysterious connection to Evelyn. It was as if Lillian Adams had sprung from the ether, her past a blank slate, save for that single, baffling photo. She worked at a local bookstore, the Book Nook. Dr. Mitchell informed her one morning, handing her a small, worn paperback. Her manager said she was quiet, a good worker, kept to herself. Evelyn clutched the book. It was a collection of classic American short stories, dog-eared and well-loved. Inside on the flyleaf was a faded inscription. To Lily, for endless adventures, love, S. S? Evelyn wondered aloud. Do you know who S is? Dr. Mitchell shook his head. No, Mrs. Reed. We haven't found any other names or contacts. Evelyn decided to visit the bookstore. It was a cozy, independent shop. Filled with the scent of old paper and fresh coffee, a young woman with bright, curious eyes greeted her. Can I help you? Yes, Evelyn began, feeling a pang of trepidation. I'm looking for information about Lillian Adams. She works here, I believe. The girl's eyes clouded with sadness. Oh, Lily, yes, she does. You did. She's in the hospital. We're all so worried. Evelyn explained, carefully, her strange connection to Lillian. The girl whose name was Chloe listened with wide eyes. Lily never talked much about her family, Chloe offered. She was adopted, I think. She mentioned it once, vaguely, said she didn't know her birth parents. Adopted. The word hung in the air, a new piece of the puzzle. But it didn't explain Evelyn's photo or Lillian's claim. Did she ever mention anyone named Evelyn? Evelyn pressed, her heart quickening. Chloe frowned, thinking, not that I remember. She talked about her adoptive mom, Sarah. Sarah Adams. She said Sarah raised her, and they were really close. Sarah Adams. The name sparked a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker in the furthest reaches of Evelyn's memory. Sarah, a childhood friend? A long-forgotten name from a different lifetime? Back at the motel, Evelyn pulled out the old photo album she'd brought from Boston. Its pages were yellowed, the photos faded with time. She flipped through pictures of her parents, her childhood home, school friends, and then there it was, a blurry, sepia-toned photograph of two young girls, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, standing awkwardly side by side, their arms linked. One was Evelyn, younger, ganglier, with a shy smile. The other, with a cascade of dark curls and a mischievous grin, was unmistakably Sarah. Sarah Adams. A wave of memories, long buried under the detritus of time, began to surface. Sarah, her best friend from elementary school. They had been inseparable. two peas in a pod sharing secrets and dreams. But then, in high school, after Evelyn's family moved across the country for her father's job, they had lost touch. Letters had become fewer, then stopped altogether. Life had simply moved on. Evelyn's mother, bless her meticulous heart, had kept everything. Evelyn remembered her mother's habit of journaling, of noting down every significant event, every person who passed through their lives. Perhaps there was a clue in her mother's old things, something that would link Sarah to Lillian and to Evelyn herself. The thought sent a jolt of nervous energy through her. The past was not as neatly sealed as she had believed. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. The image of Lillian in the hospital bed, so frail and vulnerable, mingled with the faded image of Sarah from her childhood. Two separate threads, seemingly disparate, yet now intricately intertwined by a single, desperate cry from a comatose girl. A mystery was deepening, pulling Evelyn into its labyrinthine depths. Closer and closer to a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Chapter 4: Echoes of a Secret. The next morning, Evelyn called her childhood home. Her older brother, George, who now lived there, answered. He was a gruff but kind man, and after Evelyn explained her bizarre situation in Clarksville, he listened with a mixture of bewilderment and concern. "Mom kept everything, Eve," he said, his voice crackling over the phone. "You know how she was. There's a trunk in the attic full of her old journals and letters. I haven't touched it in years." "George," Evelyn pleaded, "I need you to look. Anything about Sarah Adams, anything about a child, an adoption, anything at all. It's crucial." George, despite his initial reluctance to delve into dusty attics, agreed. Evelyn spent the day by Lillian's bedside, a knot of anticipation tightening in her stomach. The hospital room, once a place of sterile detachment, now felt charged with a strange familial energy. She found herself talking to Lillian more, sharing snippets of her own life, of her childhood with Sarah, hoping in some unspoken way that the sound of her voice would stir something within the young woman. Later that evening, George called back. His voice was subdued, a hint of awe in its tone. "Eve, you're not going to believe this. I found Mom's journal from 1978. There's an entry. It mentions Sarah." Evelyn's breath hitched. "What does it say, George? Read it to me." George cleared his throat, then began to read, slowly, carefully. October 14th, 1978. A difficult day. My heart aches for Evelyn, though she barely remembers it. Such a profound sadness for a young girl. The choices one must make for family. Sarah has been a true blessing, a selfless friend. She took the baby. Such a tiny thing, Evelyn's little girl. To protect our family, our name. A secret kept for Evelyn's own good. Oh, the sacrifices we make for those we love. This burden, this beautiful, heartbreaking secret, I pray it never comes to light for Evelyn's sake. The words hung in the air, cold and heavy in the quiet hospital room. Evelyn's world, which she thought was so clearly defined, crumbled around her. Evelyn's little girl, a secret kept for Evelyn's own good. "George," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible. What does this mean?" "It means, Eve," George said, his voice laced with a newfound gravity, "that you had a daughter. And Mom, with Sarah's help, gave her away. You must have been so young. Do you remember anything?" A flood of fragmented images, long suppressed, began to surface. A blur of pain, of disorientation, a sense of overwhelming grief, a fog that had consumed her for months. She had dismissed it as a profound depression after a difficult breakup in her late teens, a period she had meticulously scrubbed from her memories. But now, The pieces began to fit, horribly and painfully. A whirlwind romance in college. A young man who had disappeared as quickly as he appeared. The subsequent illness. The dark days. The feeling of her body betraying her. Her mother's constant vigil. Her overwhelming protectiveness. It was all a desperate attempt to erase the evidence of a life-altering event. "I don't remember," Evelyn stammered, tears stinging her eyes. "Not clearly. It was all a blur. Mom said I had a severe breakdown. She said I was very ill." "She protected you, Eve," George said gently. "She clearly thought she was doing what was best. She loved you fiercely." Evelyn hung up, her hand shaking. Lillian, her daughter, her biological daughter, the young woman lying unconscious in the bed, the one she had dismissed as a stranger, was her own flesh and blood. The implications were staggering, overwhelming. A lifetime of denial, of unknowingly living without a child she had brought into the world. She looked at Lillian, truly looked at her, searching for the echoes of herself, of her own youth. And this time, she saw it. Not in the features, but in the slight curve of her eyelashes, the subtle set of her jaw, a ghost of recognition, a whisper from the past. Dr. Mitchell entered the room, his movements quiet and respectful. "Mrs. Reed," he began, "I have some new findings. Given Lillian's unusual resistance to certain medications and her strong connection to you, even in her unconscious state, I decided to run some more comprehensive tests, specifically a genetic analysis." Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. She already knew. She knew what he was going to say. "The results came back a few hours ago," Dr. Mitchell continued, his voice softer than usual. "Mrs. Reed, the DNA test confirms it. You are Lillian Adams's biological mother." The words, though expected, still struck her with the force of a physical blow. Evelyn sank into the chair beside Lillian's bed, the old journal entry echoing in her mind. Evelyn's little girl. The truth, long buried, had clawed its way to the surface, ushered in by a desperate phone call and the innocent cry of a young woman in pain. Chapter 5: The Unraveling. The revelation of Lillian's true parentage plunged Evelyn into a tumultuous sea of emotions. Grief for the lost years, anger at her mother's deception, and an overwhelming surge of protectiveness for the young woman lying so still in the bed. She had a daughter she never knew. Dr. Mitchell, witnessing her profound distress, offered quiet support. He explained the medical complexities of Lillian's condition, but also listened patiently as Evelyn poured out her fragmented memories, the vague outlines of a forgotten trauma. "This is a lot to process, Mrs. Reed," he said kindly. "But it also gives us a crucial piece of information. The emotional connection you both share, even unconsciously, could be a factor in her recovery. The human spirit is remarkably resilient." Evelyn knew she had to find Sarah Adams. The woman who had raised her daughter, the woman who had kept this monumental secret for decades. She owed her answers, and Evelyn, in turn, needed to understand. With Dr. Mitchell's help, they found Sarah's current address in a small town just an hour's drive from Clarksville. The drive was fraught with anxiety. What would she say? How could she confront a woman who had been her best friend, who had seemingly betrayed her, yet also, inexplicably, raised her child? Sarah Adams's house was a charming, slightly weathered bungalow, surrounded by a vibrant flower garden. When Evelyn knocked, the door opened a crack, revealing a face etched with the lines of time, yet still vaguely familiar. Sarah's eyes, once bright and mischievous, were now clouded with surprise and a hint of trepidation. "Evelyn?" Sarah's voice was a shaky whisper. "Is that really you?" Evelyn nodded, her own voice thick with emotion. "Sarah, we need to talk about Lillian." Sarah's face paled, and she stepped back, inviting Evelyn inside. The living room was cozy, filled with photos, many of them of a smiling young girl, Lillian. It was clear this was a home filled with love. They sat, facing each other, the silence heavy between them. Finally, Evelyn spoke, her voice trembling. "My brother found Mom's old journal. I know, Sarah, I know about Lillian." Sarah closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I knew this day might come," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I just prayed it wouldn't. For your sake, Evie." Then Sarah began to speak, her voice gaining strength as the dam of suppressed memories broke. She recounted the story, piece by agonizing piece. Evelyn, barely 18, bright and full of dreams, had fallen deeply in love during a summer fling. The young man disappeared, leaving Evelyn heartbroken and, unbeknownst to her, pregnant. "You were so sick, Evie," Sarah recalled, her eyes filling with tears. "Depressed, barely eating. Your mother was terrified. She was so worried about your future, your reputation. Back then, it was different. An unmarried mother. It would have ruined everything for you." Evelyn's mother, desperate to protect her daughter, had confided in Sarah. Sarah, who had always adored Evelyn, who had just lost her own dreams of motherhood after a series of miscarriages, saw a chance to help both her friend and herself. "Your mother came to me," Sarah explained, her voice cracking. "She begged me, asked if I would raise the baby as my own. No one else knew. She said it was the only way to spare you the scandal, the pain, the burden. She truly believed it was for your good, Evie. And I wanted a child so desperately, and I loved you. I loved you enough to carry that secret." Sarah described the clandestine birth, Evelyn heavily sedated and barely conscious, remembering nothing. Sarah had adopted Lillian immediately, raising her as her own, pouring all her love into the child. Lillian always knew she was adopted, Sarah continued, her gaze fixed on a photo of a laughing young Lillian. "I told her, but I never told her about you, Evie. Your mother swore me to secrecy. She feared you'd resent her, or that it would bring back too much pain for you. She truly believed you were better off not knowing." "But the photo?" Evelyn asked, confused. "My high school photo in Lillian's wallet?" Sarah smiled sadly. "She found it in an old box of my things. It was a photo of us, you and me, from high school. But her birth certificate had your mother's maiden name listed as biological grandmother, along with her father's name, which I never knew. She pieced it together. She was looking for you, Evie. She wanted to know her birth mother. She must have taken that photo as a clue." The revelation was a double-edged sword. Painful, yes, but also a profound relief. The pieces of her life, once scattered and fragmented, finally coalesced into a coherent, albeit heartbreaking picture. Her mother, in her misguided love, had made an impossible choice, and Sarah, out of friendship and a yearning for motherhood, had borne the weight of that secret for decades. "Why didn't you ever tell me, Sarah?" Evelyn asked, the question a plea, not an accusation. Sarah met her gaze, her eyes brimming with a lifetime of unspoken burdens. "Fear, Evie. Fear of hurting you, of ruining the life you had built. fear of losing Lily if you ever wanted her back, and fear of breaking my promise to your mother. It became my life secret, my burden, and my joy. A profound silence descended, filled only by the echoes of their shared, complicated past. Evelyn looked at Sarah, the woman who had been her best friend, the woman who had loved and raised her daughter. The anger, sharp and immediate when she first heard her mother's journal entry, began to dissipate, replaced by a complex blend of understanding, sorrow, and astonishingly, gratitude. Chapter 6: The Awakening. Days turned into weeks. Lillian remained in a coma, her fight a silent, arduous battle. Evelyn and Sarah, bound by their shared secret and their love for Lillian, spent countless hours together at the hospital. He spoke of the past, of their friendship, of the choices made and the paths diverged. Sarah shared stories of Lillian's childhood, her first steps, her infectious laughter, her passion for books. Evelyn devoured every detail, reconstructing a life she had unknowingly missed. Dr. Mitchell, a quiet observer of this unfolding drama, noted the subtle shifts in Lillian's vital signs. "She seems to respond to your voices," he remarked one afternoon, watching as Lillian's heart rate momentarily stabilized when Evelyn read aloud from a book Sarah had brought, Lillian's favorite, Anne of Green Gables. It was a Tuesday, almost exactly a month after the initial phone call, when it happened. Evelyn was holding Lillian's hand, softly recounting a memory from her own childhood, a silly anecdote about a school play. Suddenly, a flicker. Lillian's eyelids trembled. A faint groan escaped her lips. Evelyn froze. "Dr. Mitchell," she called out, her voice a mixture of terror and exhilaration. He was there in an instant, followed by a flurry of nurses. Lillian's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and disoriented. Her gaze swept the room, lingering for a moment on Evelyn's face, then moving to Sarah's. Confusion clouded her features. "Lillian," Dr. Mitchell's voice was calm, reassuring. "Can you hear me?" A weak nod. Then a whispered word barely audible. "Mom?" Evelyn and Sarah exchanged a look. Which mom? The question hung heavy in the air. Over the next few days, Lillian's recovery was slow but steady. The doctors carefully weaned her off the sedatives. Her memories, however, were fragmented, a swirling fog of disjointed images. She remembered the accident, bits and pieces of her life, but the faces of her mothers, Evelyn and Sarah, seemed to blend, indistinct and confusing. Dr. Mitchell advised caution. "She needs time. We don't want to overwhelm her. Her brain needs to heal." It was Sarah who first approached the delicate subject. One afternoon, as Lillian was slowly sipping broth, Sarah sat beside her bed. "Lily, honey," she began gently, "there's something we need to tell you, something important." Lillian looked at her, her eyes still hazy. Evelyn, sitting on the other side, took Lillian's hand. "Lillian," she said, her voice soft but firm, "the woman you called out to when you were in the accident, that was me, Evelyn. And the reason you called out my name is because I am your birth mother." Lillian's eyes widened, a flicker of comprehension, then disbelief. My birth mother." She looked from Evelyn to Sarah, then back to Evelyn. "But, Mom, you're my mom." She gestured to Sarah. Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I am, sweetheart. I raised you. I'm your mother in every way that counts. But Evelyn, she gave birth to you. It's a long story, Lily. One that we kept secret to protect everyone." Slowly, carefully, Evelyn and Sarah, together, wove the intricate tapestry of Lillian's past. They spoke of the difficult circumstances, of Evelyn's young age, and her mother's misguided intentions, of Sarah's selfless act of love, Lillian listened, her expression shifting from bewilderment to shock, then to a profound sadness. "So, all this time," Lillian whispered, her voice raw, "I had another mother, and I never knew. We are so sorry." "Lily," Evelyn said, tears streaming down her face, "my mother made a choice she thought was best, and Sarah, she carried that burden to protect both of us. We made mistakes, darling, big ones. But the love, Lily, that was always real." It was a difficult, painful conversation, repeated over several days as Lillian's mind slowly cleared. There were tears, confusion, and moments of quiet resentment, but gradually, understanding began to dawn. Lillian saw the genuine remorse in Evelyn's eyes, the deep love in Sarah's. She saw the sacrifices made, the difficult choices in an era that judged women harshly. One afternoon, Lillian looked at Evelyn, a hesitant question in her eyes. "Why did you call out for me in the accident?" Evelyn asked gently. Lillian closed her eyes, trying to recall. I had found that photo of you and Mom Sarah in her old box, and I had seen the name on my birth certificate. Evelyn, I had a feeling, a deep sense in my heart that you were connected. And when I was in pain, scared, your name just came out, like an echo in the silence. The phrase resonated deeply with Evelyn. A silent call across decades, across miles, finally answered. Chapter 7. New Beginnings. Lillian's physical recovery progressed steadily. Her head injuries were healing, and her body was regaining strength. But the emotional healing was a more delicate process. She had two mothers now, two women who loved her fiercely, but in profoundly different ways. Evelyn decided to stay in Clarksville indefinitely. She found a small apartment, determined to build a relationship with the daughter she had unknowingly lost and now found. Sarah, too, was a constant presence, her love for Lillian unwavering. The three women began to forge a new family unit, one born of complicated truths and profound love. Evelyn and Sarah, once separated by a secret, now found a renewed bond in their shared devotion to Lillian. They spent hours talking, reminiscing, and most importantly, forgiving. "I forgive you, Evie," Sarah said one evening, holding Evelyn's hand. "For not knowing, for the circumstances, it was never your fault, and I forgive myself too for carrying this for so long. It was a heavy burden, but it gave me the greatest joy, Lily." "And I forgive you, Sarah," Evelyn replied, tears in her eyes. "And my mother. They did what they thought was right, misguided as it was. And because of you, Sarah, I have my daughter back. You raised her beautifully." Lillian, too, found her own path to understanding and forgiveness. It wasn't easy. There were moments of anger, of feeling like a pawn in a larger game. But the genuine love and remorse radiating from both Evelyn and Sarah slowly melted her defenses. She saw the love they both held for her, a love that transcended the decades of secrecy and misunderstanding. One sunny afternoon, months after the accident, Lillian, still a little unsteady but walking on her own, visited the bookstore where she used to work. Chloe, her colleague, hugged her tightly. "Lily, it's so good to see you," Chloe exclaimed. "Are you okay?" "I am," Lillian said, a soft smile gracing her lips. "Better than okay. I found my family." She gestured to Evelyn and Sarah, who stood a little apart, watching her with loving eyes. Both of them. Chloe looked bewildered, then understanding dawned in her eyes. "Wow, that's incredible. Evelyn enrolled in a local art class, something she had always wanted to do, but never had the time for. Sarah started volunteering at an animal shelter, and Lillian, slowly, began to envision her future. She decided to go back to college to study literature, a passion she shared with Evelyn. The apartment Evelyn rented in Clarksville slowly transformed into a home. Lillian often stayed there, and Sarah was a frequent visitor. They had family dinners, went for walks, and simply sat in companionable silence, enjoying each other's presence. One evening, as the three of them sat on the porch swing, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, Lillian leaned her head on Evelyn's shoulder. "Mom, Evelyn," she murmured, "thank you for coming, for believing that crazy call." Evelyn hugged her close. "I couldn't not, my dear. Something in my heart knew, and I am so profoundly grateful I did." Lillian then looked at Sarah. "And Mom Sarah," she said, reaching for her hand, "thank you for everything. For being my mom, for raising me, for all your love." Sarah squeezed her hand, her eyes shining. "Always, my Lily, always." The silence that followed was not empty, but full of unspoken forgiveness, of profound gratitude, of a love that had defied time, secrets, and an impossible beginning. Evelyn, who had thought her life was complete, found herself blessed with an unexpected and extraordinary gift: a daughter, a renewed friendship, and a family forged not by conventional means, but by the enduring power of love and the echoes of a truth that refused to be silenced. Her life, once quiet and solitary, was now vibrant, rich, and profoundly complete, filled with the warmth of a family she never knew she was missing. The echo in the silence had finally found its voice.